We now return to the Windsors. Funding for the Windsors, a royal family, has been provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the annual financial support of viewers like you.
The new king followed his father's coffin. Uneasily, some said.
He seemed uncertain as to his balance and his sort of sense of direction. And he was quite alone. It was a figure of great pathos, I thought. I couldn't possibly have known at the time what was going to befall him, but he certainly, on that day, looked a sad and stricken character.
The Windsor dynasty had adapted to survive. But King Edward wanted to modernize the monarchy and break with everything his father had represented. Years later, he admitted to their conflict.
My father resisted change, and even to the day he died, he still looked back to the pre-World War I days and used to say those were the good times, the good old times. We were brought up very strictly. My father was a great disciplinarian, and sometimes when my father admonished me for something that I'd done, said, "My dear boy, you must always remember who you are." So I used to think, well, now who am I?
I think the people around the king were always looking for what you might call the key to make him into the perfect person that they hoped he'd be. But it was somehow or other, there was something missing, somehow or other, they couldn't find it.
One man who'd observed Edward closely was the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin. He thought him an abnormal being, half child, half genius, as though 2 or 3 cells in his brain had remained entirely undeveloped, while the rest of him was a mature man. And Baldwin disapproved of Edward's restless sex life.
There are endless stories illustrating how, at the end of the evening, when he should have been still dancing with the Governor-General's lady, he in fact had vanished with a nubile typist and appeared looking rather sheepish at breakfast next day.
But craving stability, he had serious affairs with married women. One of them was Lady Thelma Furness, a glamorous American.
The Prince of Wales was very much in love with Thelma Furness, and then I was walking down Park Lane, and I met Thelma, and she said, "Oh, Barbara, I was just going to ring you up to tell you I'm off to America." And so I said, "Oh, what about the little man? Who's going to look after him?" And she always called him the little man. And she said, "Oh, I've told Wallace Simpson to look after him." And so I said, "Oh, I expect to be all right." And she went off. And then the girl who was with me said, "You know, Wallace Simpson's not very, very pretty, but she's got a great charm. I wouldn't be very happy to leave my man into a charm." And I said, "Oh, that was so silly. Of course she's all right."
But Wallace Simpson wasn't all right. She stole the prince, body and soul. Wallace Simpson was born Wallace Warfield, the daughter of an old Baltimore family fallen on hard times. At 21, she married a naval officer, Win Spencer, but Spencer became a drunken bully. She divorced and married a social climbing businessman, Ernest Simpson. At first, he was flattered by the prince's infatuation with his wife. But when Edward became king, 3 years into the affair, Simpson suspected that he would lose his wife. She was a determined woman.
A clever, witty, quick, tough woman. But she had charm and knew how to use it. And, of course, she certainly charmed the Prince of Wales and charmed many others. She was American. No harm in that. But I say no harm in that deliberately because, of course, at the time, in the 30s, the Americans were still looked on as rather brash, nouveau riche newcomers.
I met Mrs. Simpson once at a very small lunch party. She was extremely elegantly dressed, but one of the hardest faces I've ever seen, with a mouth like a slit, Mrs. Simpson was after what she loved. She loved great wealth. Well, he had it. She loved making what she called a success of life. Being top historical news.
As a well-born American, Mrs. Simpson was not deferential towards royalty. She wished to meet Edward's family at the palace, where divorced women never went.
He wanted to bring Mrs. Simpson to meet Queen Mary, because he said that if my mother met Mrs. Simpson, she would understand. Well, the very thought is really extraordinary. The thought of Mrs. Simpson, she then was meeting Queen Mary, and Queen Mary understanding. Unusual thinking.
Queen Mary had promised her late husband she would never receive Mrs. Simpson, but Edward ignored his family's disapproval.
He was absolutely possessed. I've never seen a human being so utterly and completely possessed by another as he was by her.
He expressed his love for Mrs. Simpson by indulging her passion for jewels. He lavished many gifts on her, helping to design exotic new settings for the gems. On the back, he wrote childish endearments and private jokes. While cutting his servants' pay, the king settled on Mrs. Simpson nearly a third of his entire fortune. Mrs. Simpson's fleeting appearances with the king did not reveal her growing role in his life. She secretly accompanied him on skiing holidays, to sporting events and dinner parties, and played hostess at his country retreat. Edward was bored by the rituals of kingship, like the presentation of debutantes at court. His loneliness as a bachelor was rubbed in by the constant presence of the Duke of York, his dutiful and happily married younger brother, a reminder of the king's own shortcomings. Although unaware of the royal romance, the public recognized that Edward was a new kind of king, casual and unconventional, determined to bring change. He preferred his left profile to his right, and insisted that this must appear on postage stamps, flouting the tradition that he should face the opposite way to his father. He was the first monarch to take to the air, and he started the King's Flight, a fleet of royal aircraft. Besides taking him everywhere, they smuggled in designer dresses from Paris for Wallace Simpson, and lobsters and champagne. The King's behavior shocked the courtiers, his palace aides. But in public, he could do the traditional things, and do them well.
Only a few of us on parade this morning have known the awful weight of war. I hope, and indeed I pray, that never again may our age and a generation be called upon to face such stern and terrible days.
As the king rode back from Hyde Park to the palace, a madman suddenly burst out of the crowd and hurled what looked like a bomb at the king.
For a moment, he really believed he was going to be killed, and did behave with extreme dignity, calm. He rode quite gently on, paying no real attention, no panic at all. It was very creditable.
It was his finest moment, but his disillusioned courtiers thought that he needed more than courage to be a good king.
The courtiers, particularly his private secretary, had lost all confidence in him. If the king had perished in glory on that ride, I think that among the courtiers there would have been a certain amount of carefully concealed relief and a certain amount of feeling it, for thank goodness, we're going to be in safer hands from now on.
But Edward presented a bigger threat to the old order. He approved of the way fascists in Europe handled social problems like poverty and unemployment. Prime Minister Baldwin resented the king's attempts to meddle in social and foreign policy. Edward revived his family connections with Germany. Only this time, it was Nazi Germany, which the king and Mrs. Simpson seemed to admire.
They admired the authoritarian style, they shared the scepticism of parliamentary democracy, and they saw in Germany, as they imagined, a modernising, progressive nation under firm and decisive leadership, which were all the things that you couldn't say about the England of Stanley Baldwin.
He did believe that Britain and Germany should try and resume their friendship, but didn't realize quite how dangerous Hitler was and how unwise it was to have anything to do with him.
Acting on reports that the new king was highly pro-German, Hitler sent Edward's cousin, the Duke of Saxe-Coburg, to England. His first tactless appearance was in Nazi uniform at George V's funeral.
His cousin, Duke of Saxe-Coburg, who was an exceptionally stupid old Etonian, convinced himself that Edward VIII was set to become more of a dictator than any constitutional monarch had tried to be since the days of King George II.
The Duke of Saxe-Coburg met the king privately and sent this report back to Hitler. To my question whether discussion between Baldwin and Hitler would be desirable for future German-British relations, the king replied, "Who is king here, Baldwin or I? I myself wish to talk to Hitler and will do so, here or in Germany." The king's stand created a dilemma for Stanley Baldwin, as he told his family.
What made Baldwin worried about Edward's affiliations with Germany? It was that fear of not being to know exactly what Edward was going to do next that was a factor in his mind. But of course all this couldn't be said. It had to be done behind the scenes. Good government flourishes in the dark. He kept all these fears about Edward to himself.
Baldwin's fears were further aroused by the king's behaviour when Hitler marched his troops into the former German Rhineland. Hitler gambled that he would not be opposed.
According to secret German documents at that time, the king actually sent a message to his government that there was to be no question of contemplating any war or any threat of war over the Rhineland, which again is a major piece of interference in foreign policy and really not the act of a constitutional monarch.
Hitler sent a favoured new ambassador to London, Joachim von Ribbentrop. His mission? To keep Britain neutral. He would infiltrate the social circle in which the King and Wallace Simpson moved. Ministers like Walter Runciman became convinced that Mrs. Simpson was a security risk.
My father was then in the cabinet, and the government was very much worried on the security risk because Mrs. Simpson was so well in with the German embassy. And I remember my father telling me that one day there'd been a cabinet meeting in the morning, and in the evening he had to go to a reception where, rather to his annoyance because he disliked him, Ribbentrop came up and started discussing with him what the cabinet had been talking about that morning. Baldwin having reported it to the king, who reported it to Mrs. Simpson, who had been round to the German embassy.
He was thoroughly
careless in his attitude to documents and left them around, and there was even a suspicion that unauthorized people might be seeing them. So that was something which caused genuine anxiety.
The king was equally reckless in his private life. He appeared at the races with Mrs. Simpson, still a married woman. In August, he chartered a yacht, the Narlin, and with Wallace Simpson on board, cruised the Mediterranean. Never had a British monarch been seen looking so casual and so frivolous as he sauntered through Greek and Turkish ports.
He always believed it was possible to go kinging, as he described it, and then to switch off and go home and nobody pay any attention to what he did, and he could conduct his private life exactly as he wanted. And this was an illusion which remained with him.
Tommy Lascelles, once again private secretary, joined in the fun despite his disapproval. He gave diarist Harold Nicholson an insider's glimpse of the cruise.
Tommy, in fact, doesn't speak too badly of Mrs. Simpson. He rather liked her. He said that they were like two children together. When the yachting trip was over, the king said, "Now, Tommy, back to striped trousers and coats again, back to school." He thinks he really loathed being king and was determined to get out of it as soon as he could.
On his return, the king conducted some official business in Scotland with his brother Bertie, the Duke of York. He had promised to open a hospital in Aberdeen, but sent the Duke in his place. The king met Wallace Simpson at the Aberdeen station and whisked her off to Balmoral Castle. While a British news blackout kept the royal romance secret at home, it made headlines throughout the world. The American journalist H.L. Mencken called it the biggest news story since the resurrection. Papers imported to Britain even had bits snipped out of them.
We were all very ill-served by the press. When the whole world knew about this affair, we were kept in the dark about it. And it really should have come to a head before the old king died.
In October, Mrs. Simpson filed for divorce. Americans read about it, the British did not. The divorce would be final in 6 months. This left the king 2 weeks to marry before his coronation, now set for May the 12th, 1937. For Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, the king's affair was now more than a scandal, it was a constitutional crisis. The king, as head of the Church of England, could not marry a divorcee. Baldwin drove to warn the king that the survival of the monarchy was at stake. The king said that he would marry Mrs. Simpson come what may, and if this were really unacceptable, he would abdicate. Baldwin told a colleague, "I have heard such things from my king tonight as I never thought to hear." That night, the king asked his mother to receive his intended wife. Calling Mrs. Simpson an adventuress, Queen Mary refused. The next day, November the 17th, the king visited South Wales, hard hit by world depression. He genuinely sympathized with the poor and unemployed. In what was taken as a direct challenge to Baldwin's government, he declared, "Something must be done." The Prime Minister would have been more unnerved by what the king planned to tell his youngest brother that night. That he would make Mrs. Simpson Queen, Empress of India, the whole bag of tricks. The king soon sensed a more realistic option, marry Mrs. Simpson, but not make her queen. He asked Stanley Baldwin to sound out the cabinet and the Dominion governments like Canada and Australia. Then an obscure bishop named Blunt suggested the king could use God's grace.
He made rather a silly speech in which he said he hoped that the king would be a little more religious than he had been, and that for some reason was the trigger, because the press, of course, had the story, and from then onwards it was a soap opera.
Liberated at last, the press told the British public about the abdication crisis for the first time. Wallis Simpson became the woman who'd stolen their beloved king. Hate mail poured in. There were threats to throw acid in her face, even to assassinate her. The king's aide, Dudley Forward, opened the letters himself.
England loathed her. Britain loathed her. I'm always surprised that she was never murdered. They loathed her. And there are still people that loathe her too.
At her house in Cumberland Terrace, bricks were hurled through the windows. Mrs. Simpson fled to the south of France, where she sought refuge with old friends. From here, she issued a statement offering to give up the king. In a confidential letter, she had already told her aunt that she might have to do this. "I should cease to be as powerful or have all I have today," she wrote, "but I should be comfortably off and have had a most interesting experience."
She was prepared, in fact, would willingly have disappeared. But indeed, on one occasion, His Royal Highness did say to me, "Do you know, Wallis said that she'd go away and I'd never find her again." And I looked at her and said, "Wallis, if you think the King of England can't find a woman, there's something wrong with you, and I'll find you wherever you are."
Back in London, the cabinet was told by the Dominion governments that they would not accept Mrs. Simpson either as Queen or even as Edward's wife without the title of Queen. Baldwin had the king in checkmate. Waiting to be told his fate was the next in line to the throne, the Duke of York. "I feel like the proverbial sheep being led to the slaughter," he said. His wife Elizabeth complained, "Everyone knows more than we do. We know nothing, nothing." But there was still the possibility that the king might gather a party round him and refuse to go.
My opinion of the king, he should marry who he loves. He's been a good chap to the working class. That's my opinion of him.
What are your views on this?
I think the king should marry the woman he loves.
If he'd tried to create a king's party, if he'd done that, then he would have split the country. And then there would indeed have been the most terrible crisis in the monarchy, and in some ways the country would have been profoundly shaken. But that didn't happen. He went like a lamb.
It was very dark, gloomy, late autumn or winter day, and I well remember hearing, and we thought the world was coming to an end, roughly speaking. None of us wanted an abdication.
On Friday, December the 11th, 1936, the king broadcast his decision to the nation.
You all know the reasons which have impelled me to renounce the throne. Believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love.
I've never been so amazed in my life, because suddenly here was the king speaking in what to me was women's magazine language. I mean, that phrase, the woman I love, it just wasn't the way that a king spoke.
The abdication speech was, I thought, well done if you accepted the premise that you gave up thrones for love. And I think a lot of people felt if you were lucky enough to have a throne, don't give it up for love, unless the love is very suitable.
And when he started off by saying that, unlike his brother, he had no family, no wife and children to love,
and therefore he needed the love of another woman. Therefore he'd have to give up the throne. You felt you were losing your own family. And I'm not ashamed to admit it, I cried.
And now we all have a new king. God bless you all. God save the king.
That the high and mighty Prince Albert, Frederick, Arthur, George.
Edward's reign had lasted only 10 months. What many now wondered was how long his brothers would last.
Liege Lord George the Sixth. God save the king.
The ceremony will be held as originally scheduled on May the 12th. Changing over from King Edward to King George, manufacturers go about their interrupted business, philosophically proceed to liquidate.
While preparations went on to crown King George VI king, those closest to him worried whether he could do the job. So did the king himself.
My first word must be one of praise for the enterprise, enthusiasm, and hard work which have made it possible.
He actually felt that he wasn't up to it. How could somebody so shy, who stammered so badly, who'd always been his brother's shadow, how could he suddenly take over the throne in such terrible circumstances?
When this country was still under the cloud of a long industrial depression.
I think he just felt the burden was too much for him, and so he broke down and sobbed on Queen Mary's shoulder. I think he had a sort of mini nervous breakdown there.
Edward VIII was glamorous, attractive, much admired around the world. George VI was a man of very limited charisma, who certainly wasn't a film star in the way that his elder brother was. So one of the problems once George VI and Queen Elizabeth had taken over was how to project them as a glamorous, publicly appealing couple. And the main way in which this was done was to stress the glamour and public appeal, not of the king, but of the Queen.
She was, and is, the most marvellous, sparky personality. He could never have done it without her. And she carried him along. And she had all the charismatic qualities that he so conspicuously lacked. But she was is also, extremely tough character. Very tough, even ruthless character.
Cecil Beaton was brought along and took a whole series of photographs of Queen Elizabeth in Buckingham Palace. And these pictures, which were carefully photographed and carefully doctored and touched up, were extremely successful in projecting an image of, as it were, wholesome glamour, which Queen Elizabeth very much epitomised. He makes her look a great deal slimmer, a great deal sexier, and a great deal more glamorous. It's really cosmetic surgery, but you do it on the pictures rather than the person.
On the eve of coronation, it's a London transformed by decoration that meets the gaze of visitor and resident in every street. Along the Mall...
Despite the Queen's best efforts to give George VI confidence, he would have to take the coronation oath alone.
As the coronation drew near, certainly there were a lot of rumours about the state of the King's health, that he wouldn't be able to carry it through. But it got so bad that there were, bets on the stock exchange, rumours in the newspapers.
And book me 200 more coronation risk at the same price.
Defying the odds, the King bravely faced the ordeal of his coronation.
I think that he was carried through the actual ceremony by a deep sense of exaltation, of this anointing, which was a sort of sacred rite coming down from the Saxon kings.
In France, with her future husband, Mrs. Simpson listened to the coronation on the radio and later admitted all the while the mental image of what might have been and should have been kept forming, disintegrating and reforming in my mind. The pomp and circumstance blotted out the memories of Edward VIII. George VI gave the ex-king a new title, the Duke of Windsor. The Duke's first priority was to marry the woman for whom he'd sacrificed so much. The world's press flocked to the borrowed Château de Condé in the Loire, where the wedding took place. Sorely tried by many phone calls from his brother, the new king refused to answer any more, taking their cue from Queen Mary, who was implacably hostile to Mrs. Simpson. Edward's brothers did not come to the wedding. Edward's old friend, Major Fruity Metcalfe, was best man. His wife, Lady Alexandra, took many of the photos at the wedding.
There weren't very many friends at the wedding. May I read you my description of the wedding, because I think I wrote down there and then what I could better now. It was hard not to cry, and in fact I did. It could be nothing but pitiable and tragic to see a King of England of only 6 months ago, an idolized king, married under those circumstances. And yet, pathetic as it was, his manner was so simple and dignified, and he was so sure of himself in his happiness that it gave something to the sad little service which is hard to describe.
I think she was horrified. Can you imagine having to make somebody happy who has given up the world for you? What responsibility.
An early blow to their happiness was struck by King George VI, who denied his brother's wife the title Her Royal Highness, which should have been hers by right. After the wedding, Dudley Forward knew that he had to convey the news to the unsuspecting Duke.
And that literally broke his heart. It was a painful moment. And I had to say, I'm afraid, sir, she is not going to have the privilege of being Royal Highness. And perhaps I shouldn't say it, it's too intimate. His Royal Highness burst into tears on my shoulder and said to me, Dudley, you always will consider her our Royal Highness, won't you? And I said, sir, she will always be treated by me as if she was a Royal Highness.
He never forgave the family, and he never got over it. It remained a permanent sore. It affected almost everything that he did, you know.
The Duke and Duchess met novelist Barbara Cartland on their honeymoon in Paris, dining at Maxime's.
And I was watching them, because I was sitting like this, and they were they're just there, and I could see. And he was saying, I want some butter. Waiter, I want some butter. Nobody brought him any butter. And I thought, isn't it awful when you give it up, when you give up the crown, when you give up the importance? That's the trouble. The waiter doesn't even pay any attention to you. It's really rather sad.
Feeling humiliated and angry, the Duke leapt at an offer to make an official visit to Nazi Germany.
He spoke an excellent German without any accent, and he tried to do everything to be nice to us. For instance, he was clicking the heels what was a little bit ridiculous, so nobody even dared to tell him. Hitler was honored to have a former British king coming to the Obersalzberg.
The London Times of October the 13th reported, His Royal Highness acknowledged with smiles and the National Socialist salute the greetings of the crowds. He explained himself to Dudley Forward.
He once said to me, "Didn't I wave nicely? Wasn't that cunning?" Or something like that. But then again, if you went to a country where they rub noses, well, you would rub noses. And therefore, if you give a Heil Hitler, it was merely good manners. But he certainly wanted to try and get over an embarrassment. The real embarrassment should have been that we shouldn't have been there.
I think that he caused his brother and his sister-in-law a very considerable anguish. I've little doubt of that. On the other hand, he didn't do that just to be offensive.
They liked it very much, what they have seen. And I must tell you, we showed them the best things, that's clear.
The Duke wasn't alone in wanting to see the best in Nazi Germany. A year later, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain went to Germany to try and appease Hitler. His efforts postponed war. On his return from Munich, with the piece of paper, which he thought promised peace, Chamberlain was congratulated and feted by the King and Queen, who were as committed to the popular policy of appeasement as the Duke of Windsor.
George VI, I think, made the biggest constitutional blunder that's been made by any sovereign this century. By appearing on, as he did, on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with Neville Chamberlain, was identifying himself with one party position on one of the most controversial issues of the day.
No one could ask a better day for the start of the royal tour.
The policy of appeasing Hitler failed. In March 1939, German troops moved into Czechoslovakia. In May, the King and Queen left London for America. Enthusiastic crowds broke through the police cordon. The King and Queen had accepted an invitation from Franklin Roosevelt, who wanted to strengthen links with Europe's democracies in the hope of deterring Hitler.
And perhaps never before has a newsreel camera captured such charming informal close-ups of almost every member of our royal family.
This was quite a brave thing for the King and Queen to do because the United States were, after all, Windsor territory in some ways. Wallace was an American. There was a lot of sympathy for the Windsors over there. There was a party called the Friends of the Duke of Windsor, and there was a great deal of feeling that the Duke of Windsor had been jockeyed off his throne and this kind of thing. Again, then there was personal prejudice against the king, thinking that he was virtually an idiot. The Queen was a dowdy old creature. And so they set off with considerable trepidation.
While they were at sea, the Duke of Windsor, living in France, tried to upstage his brother by broadcasting a peace message carried by NBC.
There is no land whose people want war. This I believe to be as true of the German nation as of the British nation to which I belong, as it is of you in America.
This is the first time in history that ruling British monarchs have ever set foot in the capital of the nation that once formed a part of their empire. Secretary Hull
The Duke and the King vied for America's attention. The clear winner was the King.
600,000 persons braved the heat to witness the most impressive welcome ever accorded capital visitor. The Queen and the First Lady are to ride together.
Most of the Americans were expecting a pretty dull, frowsty couple. And in fact, there have been many comparisons, not, as you imagine, polite ones, between Wallis Simpson's extreme chic and the Queen's alleged dowdiness. And I think they were all taken by surprise by how pretty she looked. I don't think you could ever have called her chic, but she was well dressed in a royal way. She had this beautiful smile, wonderful complexion, great charm, and looked like a queen. Roosevelt and the King established a personal relationship, a rather father-son relationship, and they discussed topics which would be of great interest should a world war break out.
The King and the Queen felt this trip had made them. It gave them the confidence and stature they would need in the trying days ahead. Shortly after their return, Britain declared war on Germany. Hitler's blitzkrieg swept across Europe. Britain was isolated. The war claimed the political life of the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, in whom the King had placed his faith. He was obliged to accept Winston Churchill, who had championed his brother Edward. Churchill dominated the hesitant King.
Of course, the problem for him throughout the war is that he's constantly outshone by Churchill.
That Hitler, with his tattered lackey Mussolini at his tail, and Admiral Darlan frisking at his side, pretends to build out of hatred, appetite, and racial assertion a new order for Europe.
Churchill is a man of Periclean and mesmeric eloquence. George VI stammers. Churchill is the warlord, the man who decides grand strategy. George VI wears uniforms but doesn't actually do anything. And he's not able to project himself as the kind of warrior king, which is what historically monarchs had always been.
Once again, it was the Queen instead who was projected as a national figure and as her husband's guiding light.
She was a very reassuring presence then, and one did have a feeling that she was a considerable contributor to the feeling that nothing could go wrong.
In November 1940, as the King and Queen sat near a window in Buckingham Palace, it was hit by 6 bombs.
It was bombed by a Dornier, which came straight down the Mall. One hit the chapel and more or less demolished it, and another one, I believe, fell inside the courtyard. And, of course, all the splinters went up, and this could have killed them both.
The King suspected the attack was part of a German plot to kill him and return his brother to the throne. The Queen took a more positive view. Now we can look the East End in the face, she said. Unlike many of the wealthy, the royal family stayed in London to face the Blitz during the day. Some felt they should send their daughters to Canada. The children won't leave London without me, said the Queen. I won't leave London without the King, and the King will never go. It was a remark a whole generation never forgot.
When King George VI and Queen Elizabeth came down to the East End to walk round, I think that really began the breakdown of the aloofness and the mystery of the unknown that we'd always imagined the royal family to be in. They were with us. And that was the difference. I mean, to see the present Queen as a young girl in an ATS uniform and a pair of dirty old dungarees underneath a car, getting it clean and straight, had to be seen to be believed. but it became that she was one of us.
Eleanor Roosevelt got the same sense of the royal family sharing the national austerity when she came to visit.
To welcome the President's wife on her visit to Britain, the King and Queen went in person to meet her train at Paddington.
Her bathtub at Buckingham Palace was limited to 5 inches of water. Her room was cold and draughty, but her dinner was served on gold plate. The exiled Duke of Windsor tried to join the war effort at home, but was fobbed off with a staff job in France.
I think he was disappointed at not being given a job in this country. But I quite understand why he wasn't, because it would have been very, very difficult, impossible for his brother.
The Windsors did their best to be patriotic until forced by the German invasion of France to become refugees. They fled to Spain, where they were suspected of treating with the enemy.
Hitler had the idea, and Ribbentrop, that they should use their old friend, the Duke of Windsor, as a possible king after the German victory, and they even offered him money. The idea was to be very generous to him if he shows publicly his sympathy for the German side.
The Nazis also plotted to kidnap the Windsors, but the Duke and Duchess were put out of harm's way. They were sent to the tiny colony of the Bahamas, where the Duke became governor.
I very much doubt that the British government has it in mind at the present that my official activities should extend beyond the confines of the Bahama Islands.
Here they nursed their grievances for the rest of the war. Back in London, the Duke's rival brother presided over the triumphant day of victory in Europe. Now firm friends with Churchill, they shared the glory together.
The whole of London was full of joy. I remember a song at the time, I'm going to get lit up when the lights go up in London. And this was rather the feeling.
King George and his family, whom he proudly called Us Four, had earned a lifetime's popularity. The hope for post-war change brought in a Labour government under Clement Attlee. The king reluctantly accepted the new regime.
Today, Great Britain is painfully aware of how great was the cost of the victory she won, how desperate were the wounds she sustained.
War had drastically reduced the empire's wealth. And even the brave show of the victory parade could not hide its weakness. The Indian regiments marching in the parade reminded the king that his empire was under threat. He was told he could not visit India. Instead, advised by the government, he had to watch his cousin Lord Mountbatten give the Indian Empire away. "Everything's going," said the king, "and soon I shall have to go too." George VI mourned the loss of empire privately. Plagued by lifelong illness, he often boiled over.
He would suddenly get extremely annoyed about some quite trivial thing, and sort of there would be a violent explosion, and it would be absolutely terrifying.
Although he could not go to India, in 1947 the king and his family did go to South Africa, then in the Commonwealth. As they drove through tumultuous crowds, the king became increasingly nervous. Peter Townsend was in the car with him.
I was up in front next to the chauffeur. I must have heard a shout or something behind. I noticed, I think, two black hands gripping the hood. The hood was down, gripping the hood like that. And the Queen, with her parasol, was bashing these two black hands. And finally, a member of the policeman just in front caught hold of this man and knocked him out, I suppose. And the reason why he made this extraordinary dash, he explained later, was that he wanted to give Princess Elizabeth 10 shillings for her birthday.
Princess Elizabeth received more presents when she returned to England to marry the man she loved. He was Lord Mountbatten's nephew. After war service in the Royal Navy, Prince Philip of Greece had taken the Mountbatten name with British nationality. The wedding was a rare distraction from the austerity of 1947. Among the wedding presents were the collected clothing coupons of the cabinet. Other brides protested that there were no extra coupons for them. What few noticed were the absentees.
For the people who had come from afar, the wedding was a family wedding for the entire British people. Outside the palace, 100,000 people surged forward in a solid mass. They wanted Elizabeth. They wanted Philip.
The family guest list displayed the dynasty's instinct for self-preservation.
Part of the king's survival policy from the monarchy after the war was a cutting off of those German relations. None of them were asked to the wedding of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip, although Prince Philip's sisters were married to German aristocrats.
Another absentee was the Duke of Windsor. He now realized he was condemned to a life sentence in luxurious exile with his wife, cut off from the family.
There he was leading this utterly trivial life of sort of playing golf and going to the theatre and going on holiday. But what did it mean, going on holiday? I mean, life was one big holiday. And, you know, one just thought how tragic to think that this man was the King of England and this is what life has become.
Despite his sadness, the Duke retained his health, but the pressure had virtually destroyed his younger brother. Soon he had to have a series of operations.
I'm glad to say that he continues to make most excellent progress.
The king had his lung removed, but was not told he had cancer. The media downplayed the gravity of his illness.
It is good to see His Majesty looking so well.
On January the 31st, 1952, King George saw Princess Elizabeth off on a Commonwealth tour. It was to be their last farewell.
The king walked with death as if death were a companion, an acquaintance whom he recognized and did not fear. In the end, death came as a friend.
Churchill, once again Prime Minister, adopted the motto of the Victoria Cross for his message on the King's wreath. It said simply, "For valour." Although he attended his brother's funeral, the Duke of Windsor was not invited to the funeral lunch. The Windsor women closed ranks against the man they blamed for the premature death of the king. The royal matriarchy was centre stage. The burden of the crown now fell upon the 25-year-old Elizabeth II.
My whole life shall be devoted to your service.
She was a bird born in a gilded cage.
She was young, new, vibrant and different.
Giving up that marriage was tragic, really.
Divorce in those days was big stuff.
They blamed the royal family for her death.
They declared open season on the royal family.
Here's something that Hollywood couldn't possibly invent.
The story goes on.
You can purchase the Windsors on video for $29.95 plus shipping and handling. To order this 4-hour series, call WGBH Boston Video at 1-800-255-9424.
Funding for The Windsors, a royal family, has been provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the annual financial support of viewers like you.
This is PBS.